person who's speaking.
To go,
Yeah.
That's why. But we agreed on. I mean, I may occasionally disobey my taskmaster, but what we agreed on was, nodding and doing other forms of attempted encouragement. But there may be moments where we go.
We do that. Even I do that.
Yes, I'll start with my first introduction to chimps when I was about 4 or 5 years of age. And I went to the St. Louis Zoo, and they had a very, very famous show there, which always had about 200 or 300 people. And it was a small stage in the middle with a moat around it. And the chimpanzees came out and did all kinds of things, and the audience watched. And they did things like walk on stilts, jump through a ring of fire, race a motorcycle through a ring of fire. And there were about 20 to 25 chimpanzees on the stage at one time, and then they would go back to their seats and sit down, and they would put a little hook on something that was around their waist when they sat on their little pedestal, and then the other chimps would go out and do their act. And I was just amazed at what I saw, and I saw in what they did a level of intelligence, and I was sure that they were very intelligent. So I asked my dad to take me backstage and let me talk to the people who were in charge of the chimps. And when I went back, they had some chimps sitting with them at a table, and some other chimps were kind of happily sitting in their cages behind the table. And I immediately wondered, why are some chimps out and some chimps in? And they said, well, we have to take turns and everybody has to get fed. And I said, how do you do that? And they said, well, the chimps just bring the food out. And I said, what? And they said, yes. And a chimp came out with some food and put it down on the table, and those chimps ate, and they ate, and everybody was having a meal. I just thought it was astonishing. And I said, how do you get them to do this? And they said, oh, we just do things with them, and they learn how to do these things. And I thought that was really amazing as a young child. And the only thing I knew how to express what I wanted to do, which then I wanted to understand how these chimps came to do that. That's what I wanted to understand, but I didn't know how to express that. So I said, when I grow up, I'm going to be a chimp trainer. And then when I grew up, because I still wanted to understand behavior, I took some courses in psychology. And my desire to understand behavior, I think, came from my father always saying, I have 7 kids and you're all so different. I try to do the same things with you and you're so different. How can you be so different? So I got an early interest in understanding behavior. And I had a great course in psychology. I had a great course in Freudian psychology. I had a great course in behaviorism. I had a great course in all the 4 fields of psychology as an undergraduate my first year at Colorado College. And I knew that I was going to go in psychology. And I was very anxious to work with B.F. Skinner because I read Walden and I thought, we have this world that's a kind of a problem. We have a lot of wars, and I was born during a war and didn't get to see my dad, and I really didn't want another war. And I thought, not as a psychologist who heals a person, but can I be a psychologist that in some way at least writes one paper that can help heal the world? And when I went to, a clinical setting and people took me into these homes or institutions where I saw lots of people that had problems, I knew that psychology was not really working for those people. They might have all these wonderful theories you could read about in the books and all these things, and it made a lot of sense, but you go into a place like that and, well, there's a big problem. It's not working. So I got hopeful that Skinner could help find a way to make things work, because he was going to help control behavior in the ultimate sense, not in the despotic sense. So I thought maybe there would be hope if I could understand that. And I sat right here in this room, and I decided to go to graduate school, and my goal was to write one paper that got published. And I felt if I did that, I would have used my mind and I would have made a contribution to society. So I was finishing undergraduate work, and I got nominated for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, which was a big surprise to me. But they had a committee come and interview and everything, and then they asked this question that apparently everybody else misanswered but me. And they said, how do you do the ideal experiment so that you're sure you get the right answer? And I said, there is no ideal experiment. You can't be sure that you get the right answer. You have to do experiments from all these different directions and all these different disciplines and really be searching for the answer. And then I gave them examples. So they gave me a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. I was really happy. I had made good grades in psychology. And so I was on my way to work with B.F. Skinner as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow at Harvard. And I had a friend that was at the University of Oklahoma, and he was visiting there, and I went there to visit him. And while I was visiting him, because I had an extra semester before the graduate program started, I thought, well, I'll just go attend some courses while I'm here, sit in on them. I'll just learn some things that they didn't have where I went to school, like neuropsych and stuff. They didn't have that. So I went to sit in on a few classes and learn a little bit. And I saw this sign on the wall that said something, chimp coming to class. Come to Psych 1 class, see chimpanzee. Roger Fouts and signing chimpanzee. So I went to a Psych 1 class. There were about 300 people there. And Roger Fouts came out with a little chimpanzee named Bowie, who had been used in a biomedical study, and he had a hemispherectomy. He was about 3. And Roger gave a lecture with Bowie right there, and then he turned to Bowie and said, I'm going to show you how he knows some signs. And he held up a key, and Bowie signed key, and he held up a hat, and Bowie signed hat, and he did about 5 or 6 things like this. And I realized that if he was really learning language, I'd already knew enough psychology and I had studied cognitive psychology and the development of the mind in the child quite a bit. Even though I was going into behaviorism, I studied a lot of cognitive psychology and language. And I knew that if that chimpanzee really had language, something was really different. And it was going to change his mind, and it was going to change behavior, or it wasn't real. So I was fascinated, and Roger said, here, sign up if you want to come to the chimp farm and learn about what we're doing. And I was like, a chimp farm? They actually farm chimps? And then I remembered all those chimps I'd seen in the St. Louis Zoo, and I wondered, did they get those at a chimp farm? Or, where did they come from? What did they do at a chimp farm? So I immediately went out there to find out what a chimp farm was and find out what this chimp that supposedly had language was actually doing. I knew nothing about Jane Goodall, although she had started her work at that particular point in time. I knew nothing about the Gardners. I knew nothing except I was on my way to Harvard. And I was there 3 days, and each day I saw something more and more profound. But the main thing I saw was that they had apes from all different rearing backgrounds. They had chimpanzees that had been reared in homes from the day of birth and had never seen another chimpanzee in their life. They had chimpanzees that had been wild caught when they were 5 or 6 years of age and came from Africa and didn't know anything but what Africa was like, and were totally in a strange world. And they had chimpanzees that had been raised as pets in human homes. They had chimpanzees that had been raised in a petting zoo with children around them all of their lives. They had chimpanzees that had been raised in a peer group without any adults living on the island. They had chimpanzees that were raised in mother-infant groups. And it was just overwhelming to me because the differences between all of these chimpanzees were profound. And I thought, if this rearing is making this much difference in chimpanzees, fundamental, basic differences that I had never seen, I'd never seen that level of differences in humans. That if that were the case, I was going to stay there and study it, and I was going to learn the effect that language had on those things, because I was interested in the origins of the mind, and where the origins of the mind go wrong, that we end up having wars and constant discord and doing all these things that as a child I just had thought we shouldn't be doing. I always grew up thinking that adults were a bit crazy because they did these really bad things, and I couldn't understand why. So I decided that this would be a way of understanding why we became as we were. And I was not going to go to Harvard. I was going to go to the University of Oklahoma. So I immediately applied and went there to graduate school. When I went there as a graduate student, the first thing that Roger did was invite graduate students out, not to see the chimp farm then, they'd already seen it, but to work teaching young chimpanzees sign language. And the young chimpanzees that he was working with all lived on an island at that time with Washoe. And on the island was a little hut made out of concrete. They're called dome homes now, and it was one of the first dome homes ever installed in the United States. So the chimpanzees actually had their own home on the island, and they could go in and out when they wanted. And food was delivered to the island, but they lived on the island without any human intervention. It was across a moat. And Roger would take a little boat and row over there and put a little chimpanzee-like buoy in the boat and row back, and then he'd carry Bowie up and put Bowie and a graduate student in a cage that was about 4 feet by 6 feet, very small cage. And then you were instructed as to how to teach Bowie language, which was one word at a time. And you taught him one word at a time by molding his hands into a position, like if it was the sign more and he was just sitting there like that, you picked his hands up and you put them in the right position and you held them together, and then you moved it like more. So then you would give Bowie a raisin for signing more. But most of the signs we initially taught him were signs of objects. So because more means do it again. The way you taught more would be to tickle Bowie, and then Bowie would want more tickling. Then you would put his hands into the sign for more, and then you would tickle him again. But the first things you learned how to do were objects. So there'd be an object like bowl, and you'd put his hands in the bowl sign when you held that object up, and then you'd hold a key or a hat or whatever. And when he put his hands in that position, you'd give him a raisin. So Bowie's reward for learning language was either a raisin or more tickling or more chasing more of what you had just done. So I started doing that, and it was, to me, it wasn't language. From the very start, it wasn't language. We called it language, we gave words to it, but we were putting our hands in places and giving raisins and tickles. It's like that. And I had a son at that point who was learning language. It wasn't what my son Shane was doing. And he was already a little bit older, and he had gone through that first phase. So I started working with a child that lived next door that was 1 year of age, that was learning language and putting his hands in these things, signs, and giving him raisins and stuff. And he was learning real language, but he wasn't learning language this way. And I began to wrestle with what language is and what psychologists do. Psychologists did these things because we were taught to do these things. This is our paradigm. And this is what you need to know if you're going to have language with an animal. And it was what the gardeners had done, and it was replication. But as I began to do it with Bowie, one day I was doing more, and we were tickling, and then we were trying to do more tickles, and very, writing down the data, how many times we did this, and how much molding I did with Bowie's hands. And I got kind of tired of it, and Bowie was kind of tired of it, so he hung upside down on the cage by his toes, and he just like that and looked at me like, oh, you can just tickle me, I'm so cute. I don't really need to sign, I just need to be up here and do a flip, and you're really cute. And so I did that, and he just flipped down and looked at me. And so he did a flip in the air, so I just looked at him, and I pointed at the top of the cage, and I went like that. And he just did it again. First trial. He knew immediately what this complex gesture meant, along with my facial expression. That was not what we were teaching. That was not what I did over and over. But that was language. That was a communication. He wasn't producing it to ask me to flip, but I couldn't flip. I didn't have the toes to hang on the top of the cage. But he then did begin to do more things to ask me to do them. He realized he could start to look, and I would look where he looked. And he could start to want to go outside the cage and want to wander around. And then I got permission to take him outside the cage and kind of go where he went. And then we got real communication established between them. But that wouldn't be what you would publish in Science magazine. You'd be publishing that these 4 apes learned these 10 signs in this way, with this many trials, without any cueing after a while, and were able to do it on their own, etc. And this is language. Why? Because these things had names, and names were language. What I had been doing was, it had nothing to do with language except the human label was put on the language. So if you put your hands like this, it doesn't mean bowl. It means Sue gives you a raisin in the presence of a bowl when she's holding a bowl up. It doesn't mean bowl. It's what you do when. And actually, lots of language turns out to be what you do when. Hello, goodbye, how are you? You may not even mean those things, but we have whole routines that we go through when we meet people, and the exchange of these things is actually more important than the actual words. So language has social behavior mixed in with it. But this was not that. It was training. So it didn't really have social behavior mixed in with it, and it didn't really have language, and it didn't really have communication. It had training, and that's what psychologists and learning theory do. So we were doing that. What Bowie wanted to do was have a social engagement, and I permitted that. And I'll jump really quickly to the Congo, where after decades of understanding social engagement in apes and knowing what every slight movement, gesture, eye contact, not only each one, but the panoply of the combination, I was watching bonobos in the wild, and I had to be very careful not to engage in nonverbal dialogue, which nobody else around me had to be careful not to do. They didn't do it. Those were animals and you were watching them. But then when I started looking at them, it's just like the subtle, see you now, and I was, they picked up on that immediately. And when the groups would be quiet, 1 or 2 females would start looking at me, and I'd look at them, and they're like, oh, maybe we could groom, and they would just start coming over to me, would just walk over to me, because I was engaged in a conversation of sorts. Pre-verbal is not the right word. We can talk without speaking, and we were talking without speaking. But most people don't talk with apes, whether they're speaking or not speaking, because they don't understand that apes are talking back, nor the subtlety with which they talk back. But language is all about that. It's not really about anything else, unless we abstract it in textbooks, in which case it's more like formal logic or math. But language as it works for us is about social engagement and social coordination. So that's what Bowie was trying to achieve with me, and he had the power, he had the mind, he had the capacity, he had the ability to achieve that. And unlike the other people standing there in the cages recording the data, I did it back. And when I did it back, I realized the power of doing it back and the power of his mind. And when I told Roger about that, he was very impressed. He didn't put it down. He understood. And he said, well, what I want you to do, he said, I think you're really good. I want you to go and work with Lucy sometime in her house, because Lucy's been human reared since the day of birth, and she seems to have a lot of nonverbal behavior that I don't see in these younger chimps who had had a kind of deprived, all different kinds of rearing experiences. And he thought that Lucy was much more sophisticated in that way, and that I had probably learned enough, that I was good enough, that I could be assigned to go work with Lucy. And Bowie was about 3, Lucy was about 7, and just starting her menstrual swelling. So you're going from an ape who's about that big with baby teeth to an ape who, is 60, 70 pounds with really big teeth. and you don't know them. And you have really no way of knowing them. But the first thing that Roger told me, in addition to thinking that I was very good, he was very complimentary of me. And he didn't try in any way to dissuade me of what I was doing, even though it was different than what he was doing. So I don't want to convey that what Roger was doing was wrong or bad or not good science or I was a lot better. That wasn't the case. Roger was doing what he had been taught to do, what he was funded to do, and what he thought he was supposed to do. And Roger was trained by the gardeners, and in very strict ways by the gardeners, to do good psychology. And the gardeners were trying to do good psychology. All the psychologists were trying to do good psychology. But I had 6 younger brothers and sisters, and I had read widely in psychology. And I wasn't locked into a grant. I wasn't locked into a position. And I could afford to think freely. And I'd always been taught by my parents to think freely. So the fact that Roger let me do that was really good. And as he let me do that, I started to meet the person who was really in charge of the lab, William Lemon. And William Lemon was one of the most foremost clinical psychologists in the state of Oklahoma. And he had lots of power at the university, and lots of power in the prison system, and lots of power in the community. And he had brought Roger there because he was rearing these chimps in all these different conditions, and he wanted to know the effect of language on this. And he had been rearing chimps for at least 20 or 30 years, and he was getting all these differences. And he wanted to understand how language interacted with them, which is exactly what I wanted to understand. And so he had purposefully placed chimpanzees in human homes from the day of birth, and they were almost always placed with people who were in counseling, because he knew those people very well, and those people agreed to do it. And they agreed to treat these chimpanzees as though they were their children. And he wanted to, at that time, know what would happen if a chimpanzee was raised in a completely human environment, especially females. And what would happen in terms of sexual behavior? Would there be sexual behavior normally at adulthood? How would they feel about it? Would there be normal maternal behavior? Because he knew that when chimpanzees had abnormal behaviors in these arenas of life, they also had not such good experiences. And he, as a clinical psychologist, was sensitive to that. So he wanted all of his clients to treat these chimpanzees as wonderful, human, as much as their children, give them complete love. So when he put them together as chimpanzees when they were adults, he wanted to understand how much was cultural and how much wasn't, particularly within the realms of things that had been claimed to be instinctive, like sexual behavior, maternal behavior, complexes of all kinds. He was very interested in all of that, and he wanted to know how much of that was embedded in the chimp. We didn't talk about the genome then, but embedded in the chimp. So he started me on reading all kinds of literature in that field. But Lucy was one of the first chimps placed in a human home, and his foremost student, Maury Timmerland, was the one who agreed to do it with his wife. And opposed to the others who were more or less his patients, Maury Timmerland was also a psychologist, clinical psychologist, and they really, really tried hard to raise Lucy in the very best possible way. And with her brother, Steve Timmerland, who was about 4 or 5 years, 6 years maybe older than Lucy. So of all the chimps that were raised in human homes, Lucy had the most conscious effort by her family to do everything possible for her. And so when I went to see Lucy, they said, well, sometimes when strangers come in and we're here, either Roger or Jane or Maury, Lucy bites them. So we're just going to send you in by yourself because we think it's a lot less likely you'll get bitten if we're not there. I was like, I don't get this. That doesn't sound very human to me. You know, would I tell a stranger to go in and meet Shane because if I weren't there he'd be, no, that didn't make any sense. But, you know, children do go off to school without their parents there, and teachers don't often like the parents there. And when I started Shane in preschool, his teacher didn't want the mothers around. She wanted you to just drop Shane off and leave, and I didn't feel really good about that either. I thought there's something's not socially right here, and I don't exactly know what it is. And I'll study psychology and I'll find out. Little did I know. Psychologists knew almost nothing about these things that I was like really wanting to go to graduate school to learn. I was so naive. So I agreed to go into Lucy's house with, you know, it's a big, big chimpanzee. And a big, big house, you know, and glass windows everywhere and a big pond out and back and no collar, no lock, no anything, nobody else there. Lucy's wandering around in this house, and I'm supposed to go in. I'm like, you know, none of the chimpanzees that I had seen, I'd heard about these chimpanzees that lived in homes, but none of the ones that I had seen, you know, I mean, they were all in cages, you know, and sometimes people sprayed hose at them that they didn't want, you know, they weren't always nice to them, and they lived in these huts on islands, and I mean, they didn't live in houses, you know, they weren't human. But they said, oh, Lucy's very human. So here I am walking into this house, and Lucy comes over and she takes my hand and she shows me all around the house. And then she has me sit down and she shows me her magazines and she starts showing me her toys. And I'm thinking, this is really interesting. And then Maury Timlin has all these huge exotic parrots, including a gray African parrot. And Lucy starts to show me the birds, and there's this African parrot that doesn't like her. And it's saying terrible things to her, so she picks up something and throws it at the parrot. And I'm like, I don't think you should do that, Lucy. The parrot's all mad. I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing here, you know. So then she takes me over and she sits me down, and she has all these objects that she likes, and she kind of has them in like a nest-like area about her, and I'm looking at all of them. And then she picks up this one that's a little human doll, rubber, plastic doll about this big, all one piece, molded in all one piece. And she's carrying it around all the time like her baby in her what we call the groin pocket. And she puts it on her back and she puts it down here and she carries it all around. And I'm just watching her, not really knowing what to do. And then she comes over and she takes the baby out and she shows the baby to me. And my interpretation is she's offering me the baby. I'm a human. I think this is a giving gesture. Little did I know, it was a showing gesture. I'm not giving you the baby, I'm showing you the baby. Later on I learned what the difference between those two gestures is. But anyway, because the chimp's anatomy is a little different and how they give things is different. So I reached out to take the baby and boom! Like, you don't take my baby. I looked and there were these huge teeth marks, and it was already blue on my arm, but there was no blood, so I thought, well, I'm okay. So I continued to work with Lucy. She might have bit me like that once or twice more. I learned it was a no. It wasn't an attack. It was a communication. And soon I was able to go outdoors, just like I'd take Lucy outside this house. There were other houses around, and Lucy was very large, and we would go out and walk in the yard. We would go for rides in my MG Sprite. I had no collar on her. Sometimes kids would play not far away, and she would look at them like she really wanted to go over there and play, and I would have to say, no, you know, you're not allowed to. And she would stay with me. I used nothing other than language.
You were speaking.
Did
she vocalize too?
She was mostly silent, but sometimes she would vocalize, but she was mostly silent. Sometimes she would sign, but she would just learn signs in this way. You hold up these things and you make these signs, and I couldn't really see that she was using signs to communicate with me. Maybe if I were more perceptive now, I would. I didn't understand quite how high her comprehension of English language was. I would also show her with my hands what I wanted her to do, like don't go over there, come here. And those are not formal signs, but they're gestures. And I just developed a feeling, a rapport with her. And so I took her many places, and one place that I was told I could take her in the car was to a place about 60 acres from the house, and it took about 20 minutes to drive there through farmland. And I was told that when I got there, Lucy had grown up romping around in that forested area, and she could romp around anywhere, and she wouldn't really run away, and I didn't need to worry about it. And when I got ready to go, I could honk the horn, and she would come back to the car. This is a big chimp. So I took her out there, and she did that. She just disappeared. And I could honk the horn, and she would come back. And sometimes she would take me, and we would romp through the forest until I was very young, and I could do a lot of things then, but I could not keep up with her. I could not climb the trees. I could not run as fast or far as she could. And she'd kind of like, oh, we're doing this, it's so much fun, and then she'd just keep doing it, and I would be left behind. And I learned quickly that when I was driving places, she would gesture where she wanted me to go, and if I didn't, she would start to turn the wheel. And I'm like, Lucy, you can't turn the wheel on the car. You can't drive. She would start rocking whenever I would do that, because she'd want to go someplace, and I wasn't always sure I could go where she wanted. And if she got really upset with me rocking, I'm in a 2-seater sports car with the top down. And she's rocking. She's as big as I am. And she's like rocking like this because she wants to go someplace. And one time she was rocking and she really wanted to go a certain way, and I was hoping she wouldn't get too upset. She was rocking. And this car came and stopped and looked at us, and they were like, there's an ape, there's an ape. And Lucy got upset, and I was moving. And she leapt on my lap and hugged me as tight as she could and put her mouth, which was bigger than my head, over my head, and just going like that, trying to hug me and calm down. And I was like putting the brake on really slowly, stopping really slowly and saying, oh, Lucy, I love you too. You need to sit over here. So I can't drive until you sit over here. And one day I came, and she went over to the back of my car. She didn't want to go anywhere, and she was like pushing up and down on my trunk, and my whole little car was going kabong, kabong, because she's so strong. My car was going up and down, up and down. I'm like, Lucy is trying to tear up my car. Why would she tear up my car? This makes no sense. She's always ridden in the car. She's being really good. She's tearing up my car. So I thought, well, I can't understand this. So I went over. She just kept doing this and looking at me at the trunk, and I said, do you want the trunk open? And she kind of smiles and points to the trunk. So I opened the trunk, and she's trying to pull the tire out of the trunk, and she can't get it out of the trunk. So she goes over to the side of the car, and she's trying to pull the tire off of the side of the car. And then she goes back to the trunk, and she gets the wrench out, and she's trying to use the wrench to take the tire off the side of my car. So I went and got the video camera. Fortunately, I had the video camera. It's very hard to have a video camera this big that's portable and tape as a graduate student right there when your chimp is taking the tire off. But I had the camera. So I filmed this, and Lucy went on working with this tire for about an hour. And finally she just gave up and said, oh, I can't do it. And mostly I just filmed Lucy for a long period of time. And then when I talked to Lucy's mother, Jane Timmerland, later, I said, why would Lucy be doing this? Did you try to show her how to change a tire? Is somebody teaching her this? Why does she want to change my tire? And she said, oh, that was last Sunday. We were going someplace, and one of the friends was in the car with us, and we were riding, and we had a flat tire. And we had to get out on this really busy road and change it. And Maury was afraid that Lucy would get hit, so he made Lucy stay in the car, and Lucy couldn't get out and help everybody else change the tire. So she just watched us, and I guess she just wants to learn how to do it. So I'm watching all of this while, 10 or 15 years later, psychologists are saying apes have no ability to imitate. Like, there's something really wrong here, there's something wrong in the whole progression of science. I mean, I'd already shown tape to Mike Tomasello of apes imitating everything. And he knew that apes can imitate, and he's publishing a paper saying they can't because he did some study in some small little confines that in that particular study they did not imitate. There's something really wrong. Lucy could imitate almost anything. There was another ape that was very, very easy to be around if you were a human. He didn't act like he wanted to attack you at all. He was an adult male. He weighed at least 120 pounds, and he had been reared in a children's petting zoo. And he was said to have been, the children could come up and interact with him and touch him from the time he was very little, and he was always been around children. So I don't know if that's why he was the way he was, or there were many unusual physical characteristics about him that looked bonobo. He had webbed toes, and his face and everything looked more bonobo-like. But at that time, I'd never met a bonobo when I only looked at bonobos in books, and I thought he was a bonobo. Somebody told me he was a bonobo because he had webbed toes, so I thought, well, he's a bonobo, and they're supposed to be friendly, so I'll take him out and see what happens. He was very friendly. His name was Pancho. So I wasn't allowed to take him off of a lead because nobody knew what he would do off of a lead. He just had been shipped there from the petting zoo. And I was really lucky they allowed me to take him out. I mean, he was an adult ape, and I said, I want to take him out. And they said, well, he seems pretty nice. You're really pretty good. You can try to take out Pancho. Kind of like meeting Lucy for the first time. So I took him out, and he had a real crab-like walk, and he kind of walked around, and then he decided he'd run really fast, and I had to keep up with him because he was on the lead, and then he realized I wasn't going to take the lead off. I was going to run as long as he ran, and he couldn't really run away. So he would pretty much stay with me because he was so strong that he could have just taken the lead away from me, but he didn't. And Lucy didn't run away. And I explained to them the dangers of these behaviors should they engage upon them, even though I didn't know if they could understand them. I always explained it to them, and they respected that. So I got to know Pancho, who was not raised in a human home, and who could communicate with me, and who could gesture like Lucy. And they both had all kinds of gestures that Roger hadn't taught them. And those gestures allowed us to communicate all kinds of things as long as we were out negotiating the world together, and we had to negotiate getting in the car, going to the A&W, staying in the car, getting off Sue's lap when Sue couldn't have you on her lap, and all those things, and sitting and not bothering the people who bring the hamburgers and the root beer to your car. You can't get out and meet them, just like you would negotiate with a child or a person who was maybe mentally retarded a bit, but you took them places and you did things with them. So I was doing that with an ape that was not reared in a human home, that Roger had taught no signs to, and I just began to think this sign stuff is kind of bullshit. So I decided I was going to focus my dissertation on the natural behavior and the natural gestures of apes, and study most of the apes in the colony and the gestures and signs that they used among themselves. There's recently a paper published by this, I think, in Science, that apes have all these gestures. They have about 30 of them. I don't know, 30 might be what they need. They can have as many as they want. There's no limit. I cataloged at least 30, probably more, but I could have cataloged more than what I did. And I focused on the ones that were just a mother-infant group and lived in a cage without any human contact. And I found all kinds of subtle differences between the gestures, and I showed that this is more communicative than what's happening in the sign language work. And because I did that, I then wanted to go to the field. My hope was to go to the field and study bonobos and the natural communication of bonobos. By that time, I had also gone and spent a lot of time watching the bonobos in the San Diego Zoo colony, and I understood that Pancho was not a bonobo. And I was very sad about that, because Pancho was so intelligent. And I understood that his rearing had made a difference in some way that I could not grasp because I didn't see his rearing. But his rearing and Lucy's rearing made a difference. They did not behave at all like chimpanzees who had not been loved. Those chimpanzees have been loved. I don't know who loved Pancho, but somebody did, and it made a difference to him. And he was able to cope with lots of situations that the others weren't. And he was able to go in and out of really bad caging conditions with really other chimps that were very dangerous that I couldn't possibly have taken out. He was able to negotiate all of those situations and yet come out and be in a human world too. And I could tell him what we were going to do and what we were not going to do, and I could study things like I decided to study hunting and if he had any hunting behavior. So I let all these chickens loose to see if he would hunt them and kill them. You know, I mean, I had the leeway to do those things, and I could do those similar kinds of things with Lucy to look at how it affected her, knowing she had never seen another chimp. So I did hundreds of small studies like that to see what is in a chimp. Assuming there was, I wasn't really sure if there was anything that was a chimp in a chimp, but I had amazing opportunity to explore it there. And during that time, I made a vow that I would never raise a chimp apart from other chimps, although I really wanted to, and I wanted to see how far I could push the envelope if I had real language. I made a vow I would never do that because I knew that Lucy couldn't. We tried to introduce Lucy to Pancho, and Lucy couldn't compute. Anyway, Pancho was trying really hard to show off his good qualities, and Lucy was like, those are bad ways of behaving, and they're making me scream, and I want nothing to do with you. And Pancho's like, I want everything to do with you. It was just a mess, you know, and so I said, I can't do this, and I can't adopt a pet like Pancho and raise him. But I need to be doing these things because these are the answers that humans, we need these answers. We need to understand these apes. We need to understand their background. We're going to learn about ourselves, you know, but I can't just be unethical in how I raise them to learn about ourselves. But language isn't what we think it is. I knew that for certain. And I did not want at that time to study language, because I thought the field was so confused about language that I would just go to Wamba and work with the pygmies and the bonobos there, and I would do something worthwhile there. I wasn't quite sure what. When I was a student in Oklahoma, I continued to work with the chimps that were learning signs, and Roger decided to take those chimps out of the little bitty cages and start working with them all around the farm as much as he could to give them a more appropriate language experience. Because I freely criticized Roger, and he did not ever take objection that I know of to my doing that. And I worked with several other psychologists in the department. I also worked with Lemon on clinical psychology, and I worked with Jack Canick on verbal behavior, and I worked with Roger Melbourne on comparative psych. And although it wasn't Harvard, and I worked with another psychologist on cognitive psych, I worked very hard in all those 4 areas as a graduate student, plus raising my son Shane and spending every single second I could at the chimp farm. I don't remember ever being inhibited as a student in any of my criticisms to any of my professors, which I think is extraordinary now. I think it's extraordinary. And I think if I'd gone to Harvard, I would have been pounded in some little shape, some box, you know. And I never got anything but interest to the questions I was asking. I didn't get answers, but I got interest and I got freedom to ask them. But the chimp farm was an unusual place. One of the things that happens when you have a lot of chimps is you have to care for them. And in order to care for them, you have to pay people to clean their cages, which is stupid because, I mean, they can clean their cages themselves if you set it up right. But, of course, nobody did that because nobody thought they could do that. So it's hard to get people to do that kind of work. And it costs money that Lemon didn't have. So Lemon was able to get the state to assign him prisoners. And in order to have time out of prison, if he were to watch over them, they were the caretakers, the cleaners, in the boots and with the hoses. And I didn't know that. I didn't know all these people that were around me were prisoners. And I knew that Lemon wanted Roger to learn how to clean and do that aspect of the work, to actually take care of a colony of apes. And that was one of the major problems there, because Roger felt he had his PhD and he shouldn't be having to take care of this colony of apes. He did it for a few months and that was it. He didn't want to do it. I think Roger really felt he was going to focus on the behavior and the linguistic behavior, and Lemon wanted him to get the whole scope of what a chimp is like and all these different ways they behave, and he wanted Roger to be around in all these different circumstances. Roger just came and taught his signs and left. And that bothered Lemon. And it bothered Roger that Lemon put these responsibilities on them because he thought it was demoting him like a caretaker. And so there was this friction. And I was sort of bouncing between it. And there were a lot of strange things that happened because of that kind of friction, and friction between Lemon and people that he had placed the apes in their homes. Each ape and each set of parents had a really different idea about how they wanted their chimp raised. Very different idea about how they did it, you know, and whether it should be in a little playpen or shouldn't, or should do this or that or shouldn't. And then Roger had his own ideas about how this chimp should be if he was going to do signs with it. Lemon had his ideas, and my job, well, one of the jobs I took on was to do Piagetian testing with apes in all of these different environments. So I got to know all of the different chimps that lived in human homes, and I did Piagetian testing with them. And that made me realize that it's not so simple as human rearing or not human rearing. It's this human with these thoughts and these feelings and this relationship with Lemon himself, this clinical relationship, and then their relationship with their husband or any kids. And I was like, oh, this is like way too much for me to compute, but I could see it all being played out. And I didn't really know as a psychologist what to do about that, but I was enmeshed within it. And I didn't really know what to do when I went to work with Allie, a young male that was being raised in a Catholic home, and he was being taught to say the rosary. And this was very important. And I just didn't, it was like, do not compute. I didn't know what to do. And Itai has recently been to Mali and talked about a young chimp that was raised in he doesn't know how it was raised. He got in a zoo situation the same way Pancho, we kind of found Pancho, and this young chimp, he's an adult male now, Itai says prays to Allah 3 times a day, and he puts the little thing on his head, and then he puts the little cloth out, and he fixes it all out, and he bows down, and he doesn't have sex with the other females. I mean, he doesn't, you know, and I'm like, yes, Itai, I've seen these things happen. I know what you're talking about, and I've not known what to do about this, and I didn't know what to do about it when I was in when I was in Oklahoma. I also didn't know what to do about all these people that were taking care of the chimps that didn't seem to understand them or get it. You know, it was very concerning because I spent a lot of time just in the building, just watching, like 2 years every day for my dissertation, actually watching. So I began to watch these people, and I knew they didn't understand the chimps at all. But sometimes Steve Timmerland, Lucy's brother, would come over and work on weekends or something, and like every chimp understood him, and he understood every chimp, and he could do anything. He was amazing, and he hardly ever worked there, and he, so I started trying to make a relationship and talk to these people and try to tell them something about the chimps. I guess I felt compelled to help the situation. Well, it turned out that one of them was in prison for murder and rape. He was Indian, and I didn't know that. One of the things I did was not only go out in the forest with apes, but I started putting food out in the forest for apes. So we had places to go and food sites to find, like I later did in Georgia. So I was out taking some food out to this place for Poncho, and it was a good 30-minute walk from the farmhouse. And suddenly this guy appears out of nowhere. He's one of the workers with the chimps, and he put his knife to my throat and commanded that I do an indecent act on the spot. So I decided to try to talk to him, and be his friend. And I'm like, I couldn't really do that. And I couldn't really do that right now anyway. Maybe we could just walk over here, And I just kind of kept talking and moving and talking and moving. I didn't really confront him. And I finally, by talking and moving, kind of like, I have to see about the apes, I have to do this. I didn't really say, I can't do that, but I said, you don't really need this knife. I'm not going to attack you, and like, I like you, but, So I got him back close enough to where there were actually, I could have screamed at people, that he kind of backed off and just disappeared. So then I marched into Lemon's office and I said, this is going to stop, or I'm going to the administration. This has got to stop. So that kind of incident and other kinds of incidents added a quality to my graduate training that you don't normally experience. And they certainly made me realize the complexities of life. There was also all kinds of undercurrent about Lemon making passes at all these graduate students and these other people. He didn't ever do that to me, so I don't know. You never know where people are making accusations that I never had, other than personally a professional relationship with anyone at the University of Oklahoma. And I had those incidents and others that made I guess they helped me grow up really quick, but they didn't change my goals or what I could learn from the situation. And every day I was there, I was grateful because I learned something. And I think the most interesting story that happened, and the one that led to my meeting Dwayne and then spending my life doing psychology with Dwayne, was the Timmerlands decided, this is long before Coco and the cat, the Timmerlands decided, in fact Coco and the cat derives from this, the Timmerlands decided that it would be good to give Lucy a companion because she had to spend many hours a day alone when I wasn't there, because Jane had started working. Jane had been with her all the time, so Jane had started working for Lemon 3 or 4 hours a day, and they wanted Lucy to have a cat. She had her doll, but her doll wasn't alive. She took her doll everywhere. So they thought, we'll give her a kitten. So they got a little bitty kitten, like 5 weeks old kitten, a little bitty kitten, because they felt it would be best for her to grow up with a kitten. And my job was to introduce Lucy to the kitten. I didn't know I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any idea how to do it. So I put the kitten in this little box, and I put all these towels and everything around it, and I put it in a small room, which was a little pantry, a walk-in pantry in their house, because I didn't know what Lucy would do to the kitten, and I had to take care of Lucy but protect the kitten, and I thought she should see the kitten, but not just having me hold the kitten in case she grabbed it and bit it, or whatever. I just didn't know. So I put the kitten in this little box in the pantry, and I told Lucy there's a little kitten in there. I didn't even know if she knew what the word was. And I just opened the door a little bit so she could see the kitten, because I didn't know if she would panic or what. I never introduced anything to Lucy. So Lucy looks in there, and she sees this box in there, and she doesn't know there's a kitten. And I kind of turn the light on, and I tell her it's a kitten, and we need to be real nice to the kitten. And she looks at it, and she screams, and she throws the box across the floor, and the kitten falls out, and she's like going to attack the kitten and kill it. Kanzi did this once when he first was exposed to a cat, but it was a big cat. Kanzi threw it by the tail, and you're like, okay, is there this innate fear of cats? I don't know. But anyway, she was going to kill the kitten. And I got between her and the kitten and calmed her down and told her she couldn't kill the kitten. It was a baby. And I got it back and I shut it in the pantry and was able to stop her. But she was screaming and very afraid and was going to hit it with something. And so I was just kind of, drained. And I didn't really know what to do. And my job was to introduce the kitten. I hadn't done it very well. So I decided to tell Lucy that the kitten was really sweet and it was really kind and I really liked it, and to stay way back across the room, and then I picked the kitten up and showed her that the kitten didn't bite me, and I told her the kinds of behaviors she should do about the kitten, and then I let her get closer and closer and closer, not knowing if she would kill it immediately. But she got closer and closer and closer, and her fear went down. And when her fear went down, she'd kind of touch it and see that it wouldn't jump on her, And then she'd touch it again and let it put its teeth on her finger, and then she'd see it couldn't really hurt her. And once she did that enough to see that the kitten couldn't hurt her, didn't have the capacity to hurt her, she just picked it up and put it right in her groin pocket, and it was her kitten. And she carried it everywhere instead of the baby. And she fed the kitten and took care of the kitten. So you went from this terribly aggressive act to this maternal behavior in the flash of an eye, really. I mean, I did say things and I did do things, but the main change was that she calmed down enough to see that the kitten couldn't hurt her. And when she realized herself that the kitten couldn't hurt her, all this love came out immediately and protective behavior toward the kitten. So I was really impressed by that, and I wrote a paper and I submitted it to Science Magazine, the journal who hates me. And Duane was a reviewer on that paper, and Ron Nadler and several other people were reviewers on that paper. And Duane was the one reviewer that said, "This is astonishing and it needs to be published in Science." All the rest said, "This is anecdotal, it doesn't mean anything, this is not science, you need 30 chimpanzees to do this with." And I'm like, nobody's going to get 30 chimpanzees reared like Lucy and 30 kittens ever to do this with. So either you take this or you don't. And this says a lot about behavior. A lot about behavior. Hey, look, guys. And Duane said, it says a lot about behavior, and I want to meet that person. I want to meet the person who did that. So he called me up on the phone, and he told me he was a reviewer, and he wanted to meet me. Well, I made contact with Duane, and the first thing he asked me to do
was to
come and give a paper at Southeastern Psychological Association. So I agreed to do that, and the paper was on Pancho, and the paper was on how much language and gesture and use of gesture Pancho can do in a normal communicative context that was different and better in many ways than what the signing chimps were themselves doing. So I was trying to maintain that whatever chimps have, they come with it and they can learn to use it without this training. And this training can sometimes take them off in the wrong direction. So I presented that paper, And Dwayne was one of the people sponsoring the session, and I got very good questions, and Dwayne thought it was an excellent paper. And he said, well, you have a few days here, what would you like to do? And I said, I want to see every chimp at Yerkes. I want you to get me in Yerkes. So he got me in Yerkes, and I got to see, they had like 200 chimps then. Not only seen 30, so I got to see 200. And then I wanted to look at the records and see all their backgrounds to figure out how they were and why this one was that way and this one was that way. And I kept walking up and down the wing looking at all these chimps. And then I understood that there were going to be bonobos coming. And I told Dwayne I wanted to come back and study the bonobos. And Dwayne told me in retrospect, nobody had ever asked to see the 200 chimps at Yerkes that he knew. Nobody was ever interested in them. Nobody ever walked up and down the wing and wanted to know their names and wanted to know their backgrounds. And so and nobody had ever said that you can learn language without being taught. So he thought there was and then I wrote this paper about the cat. So he thought there was something really unusual about me. So he thought he should try to get me a postdoc, and he had money on a language grant. So when I got back after that visit, he called and offered me a postdoc, and I just said yes immediately. And then there was a lot to figure out about how to go to Yerkes. But I did go to Yerkes, and they had just gotten the bonobos there, and the bonobos had been in quarantine by the time I got there, about 6 months, and they were just coming out of quarantine. So it was the first time anybody could see captive bonobos that had been wild caught as near adults and make any sort of conclusion about are they different, are they not different, what are they like. So I told Wayne that I didn't want to focus my attention on the language work, which is where he had the postdoc grant, and that I just wanted to go study those bonobos. And I was very fortunate because he let me go study those bonobos, I don't know why I was so fortunate in all my wanderings. I only know a little bit about what happened to them by word of mouth, by hearsay. After I moved to Yerkes, the Timberlands looked for other people to be able to spend the time with Lucy, and they found someone who was quite good and could stay with Lucy a lot. And with this person, they decided that they would try to reintroduce Lucy to Africa. And this person would go to Africa with Lucy, which Jane and Maury did not want to do. Maybe they couldn't. They were, I'm sure, in tears over the whole thing, but they didn't know what to do with Lucy. They had decided that Lucy was not going to be able to integrate herself into chimpanzees in captivity or live with a male. And they had decided by then that Lemon was horrible and that Lemon had tricked them into all of this stuff, which he absolutely didn't do. They knew exactly what they were doing. But they didn't know what Lucy was going to become. Lemon didn't know what Lucy, nobody knew what Lucy was going to become. And they felt they didn't have a future for Lucy. And they didn't want Lucy to be captive, and they didn't want Lucy to be unhappy, and they were not going to artificially inseminate Lucy or have Lucy around a male and study behavior of the maternal sort because they were very angry at Lemon. So they needed a solution for Lucy. So they decided that they would send Janet and Lucy to a relatively remote but protected area in the Congo, and she would try to teach Lucy how to look for fruit and become like a wild chimpanzee. And there were other chimpanzees that she went there to do the same thing with. And she ended up, as far as I know, spending her life doing that. She may still be there. But it didn't work really well with Lucy. I've heard several stories about what happened to Lucy. The one I believe and the one I'm pretty sure it was Jane Timberland that told me, but I don't know, people have told me so many different things, I'm not certain now. I can be very certain about my personal memories about Lucy because they happened to me, but what people told me that other people told me that other people told me, that all gets confusing. But what I understood happened from the very first time I was told about it is that Lucy had a lot of trouble adjusting. She wanted to be with people. She had a lot of trouble adjusting to other chimps, a lot of trouble adjusting to finding her food in the wild. And she did make some adjustments and had begun to build nests in trees and had begun to be able to sleep on her own. But she didn't really understand dangers. And she walked close to or right up to a poisonous snake and was bitten and died quickly. But again, I can't vouch for that. Mm-hmm. And Lemon offered to sell me Poncho when he realized he was going to have to close the lab down and send all of his apes to biomedical facilities because the University of Oklahoma stopped funding it at all. And he had a huge falling out with Roger, and Roger moved Washoe to a completely other facility out of Lemon's chimp farm. And after that, it was about time for Lemon to retire anyway, and the university wanted all those chimps gotten rid of, so he was going to send them to biomedical labs, and he offered to sell me Poncho. And at that time, I was moving to Yerkes, and I had no place to live myself, and no place to keep Poncho, and I had already felt that I couldn't keep a chimp as a pet, even though I wanted to keep Poncho as a pet, and I wanted to do what I could for him. And I didn't think whatever happened to him would be right. But I said no. And I heard that Poncho went to some biomedical facility along with Louie and Bruno and a lot of other chimps, and that he did not live very long, that he died very quickly. And that's all I know. I don't even know if that's true.